Hello and welcome to our course all about attachment styles and sex. I'm so excited to be able to share this with you. I know we've had so many questions from our community for a very long time about the different interactions between attachment styles and the relationship to sex, the different patterns, pain points, challenges. We get so many questions on such a regular basis. So we are going to have as a goal for you coming out of this course to feel, number one, a sense of clarity in terms of the different patterns that exist for you as your attachment style and for perhaps a partner or a loved one that you're looking to more deeply understand as it relates to intimacy and sex and sexual connection. There can be a lot of confusion here, but when we have that clarity and certainty, it's super beneficial for our relationships. Goal number two is I want you to be able to walk away from this course with a sense of comfort and security about your relationships to sex. Really, the ability to understand your needs, your desires, and to feel safe and comfortable vocalizing them, setting boundaries, communicating your preferences, likes, dislikes. Sex is a really important part of our romantic relationships. We have mental or intellectual connection, we have emotional connection, then we have physical and sexual connection that all matter and are all important pillars that affect our relationships long term. So if we don't actually put the energy and effort into discussing these things, working on these things within our relationship dynamics, it can really hurt us. And I want you to be able to walk away from this course with the ability to deeply understand the relationship to sex in a partnership, and really what that means, the different challenges and obstacles, how to overcome these things so you can thrive in this particular arena. So we're looking for certainty, we're looking for comfort, safety, we're looking to really thrive in our ability to communicate about sex and to have a lot deeper insight into ourselves and our partners so we can have that clarity that's needed in order to properly articulate the things that are important to us in these conversations. These are some of the main goals today, and because of that, we are going to start by covering a little bit about what our relationship to sex is all about. We're going to do a deep dive into different reasons we have sex, different responses to sex that different people are likely to experience. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of relationships we have to sex, and even go into common general causes for loss of sexual desire, because they may not always be exactly what we think. Then we're going to do a deep dive into how often the average couple has sex, and we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different research studies and statistics and reporting in terms of what seems to be healthiest and what is reported to create the most satisfaction in relationships in terms of frequency of sex. And then we're going to discuss a little bit about what happens when couples stop having sex. And then we're going to break down each major attachment style and the relationship to sex. And this is where you're going to learn your attachment styles, pain points, challenges, different patterns that can be both healthy and unhealthy. And then we're going to talk about reprogramming tools so that you can deeply transform any patterns that are not serving you. And by sticking through this whole course and learning about the other attachment styles, you'll also come to more deeply understand people in your life, your loved ones, romantic partner, and have the ability to create transformation in a relationship with the proper information, the proper tools, and the feeling of comfort from understanding these things so we don't take things so personally. So these are my goals for you today. I'm really excited to guide you through this process, and I can't wait to see you in the next module. So first and foremost, let's talk about what our relationship to sex is really all about. Well, first and foremost, we have physical reasons that people have sex: pleasure, stress relief, exercise, sexual curiosity, and attraction to a person. There are these purely biological based reasons there specifically. Then we have goal based reasons that can take place nowadays in our interpersonal relationships. It can be to make a baby, to improve social status, to win over someone's approval. And whether we like these reasons or not, these are popular reasons that do exist, as research demonstrates. Then we have emotional reasons related to sex. These can be things like love, commitment, gratitude that we're expressing or showing to somebody. And then we have our insecurity-based reasons. These are things like to boost our self-esteem, to prevent our partner from seeking sex elsewhere, feeling a sense of duty or pressure. Perhaps a partner wants to have sex more than you, and so you allow yourself to move in that direction, even though it may not be exactly what you want. And what some of the important things here are to discover are what our primary motivations are currently and what we would like them to be. What do we want our relationship to sex to be all about? And the more clarity we have there, the more likely we are to be able to start off on the right foot when it comes to increasing the ability to have a healthy relationship to sex personally. So one thing you can start by doing as we begin this journey in discovering more and more about our personal relationship to sex, our partner's relationship to sex, is to sit down and to just ask yourself, what are some of the main pieces of meaning that sex has for me? Is it physical pleasure? Is it biological reproduction? Is the goal to prevent my partner from seeking sex elsewhere? Am I coming from a place of emotionally based reasons, love, commitment, gratitude? And you can take a look at your workbook and just reflect on that first exercise, just to really get the wheels turning in terms of understanding where you currently stand. And then what's very valuable to do is to ask yourself, what would I like my relationship to sex to be all about in my life? What would I like the primary motives to be behind it? And we can actually do the work later in this course to reprogram any patterns that are creating fear-based motivations for having sex so that your relationship to sex can be about truth and connection and things that are meaningful to you instead of coming from a place of fear or insecurity. Now, we have different types of relationships to sex. We have something called body-centered sex, and we have person-centered sex. Now, body-centered sex is essentially when you have sex because you like the way it makes your body feel, and you aren't necessarily concerned with the emotions of the other person involved in the experience. Person-centered sex is when you have sex to connect with the other person. You tend to care a lot about the emotions involved in the relationship and the interaction that takes place. And these two different components of sex, whether it's body-centered sex or person-centered sex, are essentially based on some of the prior reasons that we just discussed. And what I want to be really clear about in this entire course is that I'm not here to say this is the type of sex you should be having, these should be the motivations you have. The relationship that each individual, as they're taking this course, has to sex, if they're in a monogamous relationship, if they're in a polyamorous relationship, if they're exploring their sexuality, none of that is what's healthy or unhealthy. What is healthy or unhealthy is our personal relationship to our individual choices. So if we have body-centered sex because we think that that's what our partner or the person we're having sex with wants, and so we focus on that and we disown our own personal emotional needs in the relationship to sex, well, that's unhealthy because we are disowning or repressing or hurting ourselves in the process of interacting with someone else. And we're coming from a place of fear and insecurity in terms of how we make those decisions. If we are having body-centered sex because we want to explore that more, we're in a place in our lives where we're really looking to just understand ourselves better through sex and sexuality, and that's something that we're working on doing and exploring. If that's coming from a place of truth, then that's a healthy relationship for you. So I really want to be clear as we dive into this. There may be a little bit more of a focus in terms of relationships and partnerships because we're talking about different attachment styles and components of their interaction. But I want you to be able to use this material today to dive into your own personal experience wherever you're at right now, and to make sure that that personal experience and coming into a healthy relationship to sex is about you feeling 100% comfortable with your choices, your motivations, your decisions, and feeling like you're living from a place of truth instead of insecurity or fear in your relationship to sex. So in the next module, we are going to talk a little bit about common general causes for loss of sexual desire and a little bit about some statistics in terms of how often the average couple has sex. So, what are some different common general causes for loss of sexual desire? This is a topic that I heard come up so often while running my private practice because we have so many questions and it's so easy to give a relationship meaning when the sexual part of the relationship is different, is not going as well, is dropping off a little bit. And so I want to share some really important insight before we dive into all the different patterns that may help you to just look more objectively at a situation you may be experiencing with a partner. So, number one, we can absolutely have a correlation between loss of sexual desire and actual interpersonal relationship issues. It is an important topic to recognize. This can range from anything from unmet needs to resentment in relationships, chaos in the relationship, anger, fear, hurt, distrust. And I want to classify all of these causes as lack of resolution problems. We usually see when we're not able to work through problems in relationships, eventually what we do instead is we start protecting ourselves. And the more we protect ourselves, we're essentially putting up invisible walls between ourselves and other people. And the more we put up those invisible walls, the more we're disconnected. The more disconnected we are, the more distance there is, the lack of intimacy there will be. And while I want to make sure that we look at the pillars of mental or intellectual intimacy, emotional intimacy, physical intimacy like affection, sexual intimacy, well, I want to make sure that we look at those things as being separate from one another. They're still interdependent with each other. So one will still affect the other and vice versa. So it's very common that yes, we can have different dynamics where pain points in our relationships, disconnection, poor communication, trust problems or challenges, chaos, criticism, all these different things can create that distance, which will then negatively impact intimacy. And of course, sexual intimacy especially. So that's number one. Number two, we have different socio-cultural influences. And this can be things like peer pressure. This can be job stress. This is an extremely common one that impacts, I think, far more than people recognize. Body image issues is massive. Media pressure about sexuality and just how busy partners are. Like, so obviously there's going to be a big difference between if you're, for example, in the honeymoon stage of a relationship with no kids and you only work part-time versus if you have, a full-time job plus a part-time job and three new, young children running around and lots of responsibilities to other members of your family. So all of these different things will play a role. And it's really important for individuals to recognize that in their relationships, there is a correlation between expansion of stress and loss of libido, loss of presence, loss of being able to really, really interact in a healthy sexual way because our emotional state will affect our sexual intimacy. Now, is this always the case? No, but it's an absolutely strong pattern that we have to recognize and make space for. Then we have other different causes for loss of sexual desire. These can be things like low testosterone, which actually takes place in both men and women, medications, antidepressants, oral contraceptives, blood pressure drugs can all play a role in this, and absolutely things like age. And obviously mental health, things like depression, anxiety, mood disorders in general can all play a role. So it's important when we're feeling sexually disconnected that before we make a judgment and give it meaning, things like, oh, it's because I'm not good enough, it's because I'm not attractive enough, it's because my partner no longer loves me, I'm unlovable. Before we give painful meaning to those situations, it's very important to objectively try to understand the situation and look for the feedback that it's giving to you. Are we too stressed? Is somebody too busy? Do we not have good boundaries in our lives, which is causing us to feel overwhelmed, and then that falls into the relationship to sex and that suffers? Do we find that we're in a position where we have too much pressure from the media? We put too much pressure on ourselves from a body image perspective. Are there different components, mental health related, that are affecting this relationship? And so before we judge it, we want to inquire and look objectively at what information this may be giving to us. And is this really representing, most importantly, a disconnect somewhere else in our relationship? Like we're not properly communicating. And so instead of judging myself and thinking, oh, I'm not good enough, maybe I look at, a pattern in the relationship isn't currently working. And it's affecting an interdependent pillar in the totality or holistic viewpoint of the relationship itself. So really important to just keep that in mind. Now, when we discuss how often the average couple has sex, I'm going to share with you a few different studies because some of them were a little bit conflicting, but there were a lot of similarities that we can pull from overall and make our own observations based off of. So number one, a 2017 study published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior studied the sexual behavior of over 26,000 people all the way from 1989 to 2014. And then it took 3 consecutive years to put the study together and publish the results. It found that the average adult had sex 54 times per year. And this creates essentially an average of just over once per week. So this is, pretty clear when we look at the perspective of we have 52 weeks in a year, 54 times a year puts us just over once per week. Now, once per week was actually found to be just the right metric for sexual happiness and satisfaction according to a study done at the University of Chicago. And this was all about reporting satisfaction in relationships. Now, that study was done for couples that had been together for 2 or more years. Keep in mind, the previous study was done just people in general, single, monogamous relationships, polyamorous relationships, anything. And what's interesting about this is when we look at the 2+ year mark, that's usually when we're out of the honeymoon stage of a relationship. So this is usually when we've got the dating stage in the early stage, then the honeymoon stage, and then we've got the stability, the power struggle, the stability, the commitment and bliss stages, and it's all those proceeding stages. And when we look at the long-term relationships, like actual long-term relationships, something that is important to note is although we may see on television and in movies most of the dating and honeymoon stage, most long-term couples spend the majority of the relationship in the latter stages, not in those first 2 stages. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Now, according to another study done by Dr. David Schnark, he conducted a study with 20,000 different couples, and he found that only 26% of couples that have been together for 2 or more years are hitting the once per week mark in their sexual relationship, with the majority of respondents reporting sex only twice a month or even slightly less. Yet another study printed in the University of Chicago Press about a decade ago stated that married couples are having sex about 7 times per month, which is a little less than twice a week. So we have these sort of conflicting studies, and I did a lot of research around this, but we see no matter what that, despite the sample size or length of time together, we're really getting somewhere between once and twice per week on average. And in a third study, based off another 16,000 adults that were interviewed, the older participants were found to be having sex about 2 to 3 times per month, while younger participants said they were having sex about once per week. So it's important to keep in mind some of the differentiating factors here may be just about age, length of time in a relationship, expectations, cultural expectations, what stage of a relationship the relationship itself is in. So are you in the power struggle stage? Are you in the stability stage, the commitment stage? And obviously there tends to be more sex that takes place in the dating and honeymoon stages because those stages specifically are most so about infatuation and attraction, and that's sort of how we're getting to know one another. And there is an elevation of a neurochemical cocktail of oxytocin, the bonding neurochemical, phenylethylamine, the attraction neurochemical, and a little bit of serotonin and dopamine as we're getting to know somebody in those earlier stages. Once the mind becomes more used to somebody and more adaptive and sort of enters into that power struggle stage, as we're forced to sort of drop the mask and share in our worlds more, that's usually when we'll see some of that neurochemical cocktail subside. Now, it's important to note, by not dropping the mask and not sharing ourselves more, that's not what creates that neurochemistry dropping off. It's the fact that we get adapted to somebody first that then moves us into the power struggle stage, not the other way around. So this is not me saying hide yourself, be on your best behavior, because that's actually not conducive to a relationship, and it's absolutely not conducive to actually moving beyond the power struggle stage and into the important latter phases of a relationship. So what happens when the average couple stops having sex? Well, when couples stop having sex, based on tremendous amounts of research, a huge Gallup poll of thousands of people, what we find is relationships become more vulnerable to anger, detachment, infidelity, and ultimately divorce. And what we find as well is that couples feel a lot more hurt in relationships. They're more sensitive to criticism. They have a lot more fear. They have a lot more resentment. They're more likely to feel that the bond is being betrayed more easily, and there's a sense of disconnection. And this is because sexual connection and sexual chemistry are a very important pillar, like we mentioned, of romantic relationships. It's a really important part of how we relate. And when that drops off, even if other pillars are quite strong in a relationship, there will still be fears and hurt and different forms of resentment that comes up. And as we see this take place, you'll notice that it's really easy for couples to give this situation meaning. To go, oh, my partner's falling out of love. Oh, my partner doesn't find me attractive. Oh, my partner's getting bored of me. Or vice versa, right? Both parties can give a situation meaning. And so it's really important to recognize that that can take place, and to also recognize this can activate many unmet needs and spark sort of this vicious cycle where then when we give a situation meaning, we feel even more disconnected, we feel even more unloved or abandoned or not good enough, and then we sort of spiral and can disconnect in other ways. So it's really important to recognize the interdependency of these different pillars of intimacy in our relationships. And with that being said, now what we're going to do is dive really deep into different attachment styles and their interpersonal relationship to sex, some of these core specific patterns that can create obstacles or challenges, and exactly the tools we need to be able to transform these so we can have thriving relationships, thriving intimacy, and sexual connection long term. So let's talk about the anxious preoccupied's relationship to sex. So we're going to cover different healthy things, different unhealthy things, different core wounds that are connected to some of our unhealthy patterns. And then we're going to discuss really important tools and strategies for healing, for creating transformation within these patterns. And I'm going to tell you exactly how you can use these tools specifically as well. How often, at what time of day, all these sorts of things. So first and foremost, some of the healthy patterns in anxious preoccupied's relationship to sex are that they tend to be very open and vulnerable. They really care to be like present and connected as much as possible to the other person during anything involving intimacy. And they generally care to make an effort during sex and care about the other person's experience. They tend to be quite present, at least with the other person, though they may be not as present with themselves and their thoughts, as we'll go into. And they tend to, as a general rule, see sex as a strategy for both physical and emotional connection. They don't tend to compartmentalize, and they tend to value the emotional connection components as it relates to sex. And they generally have a really healthy relationship to physical connection in general. So affection, cuddling, hand holding, all these sorts of things. Now, some of the unhealthy patterns is really about, and a lot of the roots of all of these unhealthy patterns have to do with the anxious, preoccupied space where they tend to be out of relationship to themselves during the experience of sex or anything in between. So sometimes they're afraid to speak up and afraid to be themselves. They can be in a place where they don't want to share their own feelings, their own needs, even sometimes their own boundaries, because they fear rejection, being a burden, feeling not good enough, abandonment, somebody thinking that they're too much or need too much from them and pushing them away. And so a lot of their priority lies in, I'd rather abandon myself and be what this person needs from me or expects from me than set a boundary and have some kind of conflict, abandonment, or rejection from somebody. And what this ends up being is them sort of violating their own needs at times, violating their own sense of self at times, even if it's just through a lack of consideration in their ability to put themselves in a dynamic and allow themselves to just take up space as a person. And sometimes when we really break down somebody being afraid to be themselves, express their truth, when we really look at that under like a magnifying glass, you'll see that that's an element of emotional unavailability. It's like if I have to keep a mask on, I'm not being fully true, fully emotionally available to you. I'm not showing you my true self. And there is an element of I'm hiding, I'm guarding, I'm withdrawing, even if that's disguised as me being super present to your experience. It's sort of like I'm here for one-way emotional connection. So that can be something that the AP really has to focus in on and take accountability for so that they can have a two-way connection and a two-way street in sex and sexual intimacy. Another big pattern here is we may see APs be very hypersensitive to changes in patterns of intimacy. And so the moment there's a withdrawing or a disconnect, instead of trying to inquire and look for some of the things we discussed earlier, like what are some general root causes of why this happens? Is my partner stressed? Are they overwhelmed? Is there a relationship problem or challenge? Instead, APs can be very quick to personalize it and make it mean things about them that then create a spiraling in the relationship. So APs may make a situation where there's a disconnect mean, oh, I'm not sexually attractive enough, or I'm not interesting enough, I'm not good enough. If I was better, I'd be accepted. If I was better, this person would want to have sex with me. And it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on the AP shoulders in terms of like performance and expectation. And it's really painful. There's suffering involved with literally feeling like a disconnect in a relationship represents your adequacy as a human being. And so that's a really important thing to pay attention to. And what this leads to is major challenge number 3 for anxious preoccupied individuals in sex, which is that sometimes anxious preoccupied individuals can get into a space where they're so concerned with their performance, if they're being good enough, things like comparison to the person they're sleeping with and that person's past partner, comparison to other people in that person's life. They can get so consumed by that during sex they're not present with themselves, their own body, their own feelings, their own senses. Like they can literally get into a position where they're just in hyper focused people pleasing, which actually again usually disconnects in sex. It's like a lack of presence just in sort of a hidden form here. And that can really affect a person's ability to enjoy sex, to enjoy connection, to enjoy the vulnerability that comes with sex. And sometimes this can create excess pressure on a person to the point where it affects not just the experience of sex, but their thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and behaviors related to sex and their own personal sexuality, even when sex is not taking place, even when it's a time period where you're going about your daily life. This can be consuming in the anxious, preoccupied individual's thoughts about themselves, their partner, their connection, and they can really get into comparison, people pleasing, and personalization of things that are taking place in the relationship dynamic. And again, this can create a lot of suffering for this person, both short term while having sex and long term outside of the periods where you're having sex. Another pattern that's important to be aware of is that sometimes anxious, preoccupied individuals put pressure on themselves and their relationship to sex, making it about acceptance. So sometimes they'll use sex subconsciously as a tool to win approval or gain favor. And this isn't necessarily sex itself, but this can be things related to sexuality. So, the way that this person shows up, interacts, like they can sometimes think, my sense of self-worth as a person is about how sexually attractive people find me. Now, it's one thing if you really value that part of your life and that's true for you and you just enjoy like dressing yourself up and putting together your appearance and expressing your sexuality. Like, that's a beautiful thing when that's coming from a place of truth. When that's coming from a place of I need to behave a certain way in order to gain acceptance of a certain form, sometimes that makes your self-worth brittle and breakable, because the moment that you have a bad hair day, or your clothes don't fit quite right, or your chemistry is off with somebody, or you're not getting the attention that you're hoping for in an interaction, well, now it can feel like death to sense of self, because if so much of your sense of self is derived by that or through that, it can be very painful and challenging when something's off. And especially, and this is quite commonly experienced by APs, especially if you feel like so much of your relationship with your partner is based on sex and intimacy that way, but then somebody comes along that's attractive, sexually attractive, that's in your circle, that works with your partner, works with somebody that you're dating, or whatever it might be, it can really feel defeating to a person's sense of self-esteem, instead of sex and sexual connection being about what's taking place between two parties, a person bringing their true sense of self, showing up, feeling worthy of pleasure, feeling worthy of their needs and desires being seen, heard, and understood, and interacting from a place of mutual exchange there. And when we're interacting from a place of mutual exchange there, the relationship to sex doesn't feel so brittle and breakable and fragile, if that makes sense. So it can be really important to recognize that those are some patterns that can be very diminishing. And the one last thing that I want to mention here for anxious, preoccupied individuals that can be a big pattern or challenge is sometimes anxious, preoccupied individuals will violate their own boundaries in order to please somebody else. Now, this is a delicate topic, because when we look at the concept or idea of an anxious, preoccupied violating their own boundaries, this is not me saying under any circumstances that if somebody's violating your boundaries, it's your fault. Absolutely not. If somebody's violating your boundaries, it's inappropriate. It should be, dealt with legally, perhaps with law enforcement. Like, we're talking about a continuum of things here, but somebody creating a boundary violation that's unwarranted is extremely unhealthy and is never the person's fault on the receiving end. But sometimes what we'll see in relationships is, let's say for example, and this exists along its own form of continuum, let's say for example, you're in a marriage and you're tired and you don't feel well and you don't feel like having sex, you're just not in the mood. Sometimes an anxious preoccupied will be like, I don't feel like doing this right now, or I'm not interested in this experience right now. And instead of thinking, I'll communicate that and I'll make an effort to spend time with my partner in a romantic way that may lead to that another day, or I'll share my boundary right now. Instead, sometimes the anxious preoccupied will think thoughts like, and I've heard this many, many, many times over the course of private practice, working with many anxious, preoccupied individuals, sometimes they'll think thoughts like, if I don't have sex right now or please my partner, they're going to cheat, or they're going to want to sleep with somebody else, or they're going to think I'm not interesting or not good enough. And so they make a choice to invest themselves in something that's out of consideration to their current needs and feelings from a place of fear. And it's like, I fear loss or abandonment, so I'm going to make a choice to violate my own boundaries and go against what I'm wanting and feeling for that reason. And this can exist in different forms for different reasons as an anxious preoccupied, but that really hurts to do. It hurts our relationship to ourselves. The healthier strategy could be to set a boundary and then make an effort in your relationship to focus in on things that are improving sexual connection and chemistry when you're feeling good. Maybe you're feeling sick or unwell, and when you're feeling healthy, it's a good time to do it. But you have to make sure that you're able to take yourself into consideration. We're going to talk about a tool for this in a little bit. And please be very clear to separate the difference between an unwarranted boundary violation versus somebody suggesting something and you going along with it when it doesn't feel right for you because you're too hyper-focused on that person and not considering your own feelings and needs. And it's a really important thing to touch on, because it can be a very painful experience for an anxious preoccupied to go through that and then sort of register that more fully later on. Now, some of the core wounds connected to this for an anxious preoccupied are things like, I'm not good enough, I'll be rejected, I'll be unseen, unheard, disrespected, abandoned, or alone. So all of these different things can be wounds that the AP brings up or has activated by their relationship to sex, the pressure they put on themselves, and then feeling not good enough as a result, fear of rejection that leads to them abandoning their own needs and desires to focus on others, feeling unseen or unheard in a relationship because you're not expressing your sense of self and your truth, feeling of disrespected, because you feel like there's comparison or there's somebody else that is around you that you're comparing yourself to, and that person's attention isn't on you. You can also feel disrespected because of different dynamics relating to disrespecting your own needs or desires or feelings about sex. And then when somebody doesn't know what your internal reality is because you're not expressing it clearly enough, you can feel like they're taking me for granted, or they're not paying attention to my needs, my desires. And then fear of abandonment can drive anxious, preoccupied individuals to make choices around sex from fear instead of from their truth, again, from their own individual, unique feelings, needs, desires, and boundaries. So healing the relationship to sex for the anxious preoccupied has a lot to do with, and I'm going to give you some specific tools in the next part of this module, but it has a lot to do with ending self-abandonment, having boundaries, finding out and discovering your own likes and dislikes, and being present with your own personal experience in relationship to sex, more than using it as a tool to gain favor, connection. And I'm not always saying that it's skewed one direction so substantially, but it's an important thing to just recognize is possible as an AP, and to really double down on creating transformation there so you can have a healthy relationship to sex and feel connected through sex, instead of feeling like it's something you're doing to avoid abandonment, avoid being not good enough, and so on. So in the next part of this module, we're going to do a much deeper dive into some tools you can use to start reprogramming and healing any challenges or pitfalls in your personal relationship to sex. So I'm going to take you through 5 key tools that you as an anxious preoccupied individual can utilize when it comes to transforming your personal relationship to sex, because in doing that, it will transform your interpersonal relationship to sex as a byproduct. So number 1, this is all about learning to consider yourself. So much of not feeling like our boundaries are violated and feeling like we are seen and heard and understood actually starts at its roots with our own capacity to take ourselves into consideration, come to introspect about our own needs, our own feelings, our own desires, and then express those things so they can be heard and received, and we can be more seen and more understood. When we don't do that work, whether it's in our relationship to sex or in our relationship to any other area of our lives, what usually takes place is we feel hurt and frustrated that people are not reading our minds. Now, this isn't a conscious thing. It's not like we sit there and go, this person should have read my mind. But usually what we feel is, why don't they see me? Why don't they understand what I need? They should know my needs. I make an effort for their needs. Why aren't they doing it for me? A lot of the time, because we have such vastly different sets of programs and needs and belief patterns from one another, no matter how close we are to a person, people will just not know. And it's very easy to take the not knowing and the absence of actions that we would like to follow and make it mean they don't make an effort because they don't care. And the vast majority of time, that's simply not the case. So step number one here in your workbook is I'm asking you to take some time to introspect and just write down in that chart that you see in your workbook what your likes are, your dislikes are, your preferences are, the things that are important to you in terms of sex, and then rate in the column next to it. How much are you expressing these things in your relationship to sex from 1 to 10? And it's a really important exercise for an anxious preoccupied just to reflect on like how much you're allowing yourself to be inserted into a situation. So that's number one. From that, we go to step number 2, which is all about taking the top 1 or 2 findings from exercise number 1 or step number 1 and practicing communicating these things to your partner. Now, I understand that it can feel scary at first, and it can feel really raw and vulnerable to say, hey, this is a sexual preference I have, this is a like or dislike, hey, I don't like when you do that, hey, I really like when you do this, or can we try something and it will be X, Y, and Z. I understand this can be vulnerable, and sometimes when we're growing up, when we do express needs and they don't get met, we come to associate that as feeling shameful. We think, oh, because I have a need and somebody's not meeting it in my life, then they don't care about me, I'm embarrassing for having a need, I shouldn't have expressed it anyways, and we can come to associate our needs with shame. And then the more vulnerability that's required in an interaction, the more shame we are likely to feel and the more fear we're likely to have if that need isn't going to get met. So if you grow up, for example, as a kid and you just have a need for attention and your family doesn't give you the attention you're seeking for, then you think that that part of you is shameful. Then when we extrapolate that out and we think of like as an adult, you know, anything related to sex is quite vulnerable, right? You're naked, you're really open and vulnerable and raw. And the more we have shame associated to our needs in the past, because there's more vulnerability increased in our relationship to sex, the more fearful we are going to be to communicate. So it's normal to feel a little bit afraid, a little bit sensitive, a little bit vulnerable. That's okay. But we have to show up and do the work if we want to normalize this stuff, if we want to feel comfortable in our relationship to sex, if we want to feel comfortable in the expression of our own sexual needs and preferences and desires and sexuality. And by doing this, we actually empower somebody we're in a relationship with to follow suit, to be able to also communicate their desires, their needs. So step 2 is just for you to write down 1 or 2 things that you can practice communicating. And the goal here is to follow the steps in your workbook and just do a little bit of exposure response work so that you're exposing yourself to communicating and then you're following up by just thinking encouraging thoughts in the relationship to yourself. This is good for the relationship. This is healthy that I'm doing this. I'm courageous for speaking up, and really positively reinforcing through your thinking that follows the exposure piece, which is you speaking up and communicating, you positively reinforcing that in the relationship to self. And keep in mind when you're communicating, you can remind somebody that, hey, I have something I want to share and it's a little vulnerable for me at first. Or you can talk about it even to preface in your relationship, hey, I notice we don't talk about sex enough and it's probably scary for both of us. It might be vulnerable for both of us, but I think it's really important that we do it. I think it's really going to be valuable for strengthening our bond, our connection, our relationship. I want us to normalize it by practicing speaking up. And what you're going to see is just like with any other need you express, It may feel vulnerable at first. It may feel vulnerable the first 1, 2, 3, 4 times. Eventually it becomes normal. Eventually it's like the most normal thing that you do, and it's no different than saying, oh, can you pass me a glass of water? We can normalize the expression of our needs, especially in our closest relationships. It becomes very important. Tool number 3 here is going to be all about working through core wounds in your relationship to sex. So some of those core wounds we mentioned earlier, I put some tools in there: simple belief reprogramming, auto-suggestion, and we can frame it as it relates to our relationship to sex. So you can write down, by following those steps, I feel not good enough around sex or around my relationship to sex when, and put all of the different pieces in there that show up for you, and work on seeing how you are good enough despite those thoughts or ideas. So you may say, for example, when I don't feel like I look my best, or when I first wake up in the morning and I haven't brushed my teeth, or whatever it might be, like whatever fears you have, and try to write opposing evidence for why you are still enough as a person, why you are still sexually attractive enough, and why you're desirable enough to your loved one. And so try to write some things out there that counteract it. This doesn't mean, if it makes you feel more comfortable, skip brushing your teeth. This means you not making some small pattern within your life, you waking up and not brushing your teeth right away, define your character, right? If I need to go brush my teeth, that doesn't make me less of a person. That doesn't make me not good enough as a person. It doesn't make me not desirable as a person. If I have a bad hair day, it doesn't mean that I'm not attractive enough to be worthy of having sex. So we have to be able to pull those things apart and realize we can have an action or a behavior, and that's different than our person at our core, who we are at our core. And so it's really important to just recognize where those patterns show up for you personally, and some ways of reframing these things so that you can feel enough. Another really powerful way of looking at this, and this brings me to step number 4, and it's very closely related to our core wounds, is for you to look at where I'm afraid of inserting my needs, where I'm afraid of speaking up, talking about my desires. Why? What beliefs show up there? If I share my needs and they are not a perfect match to my partner's, I'll be rejected, I'll be abandoned. And what I really want you to do there is to double down on recognizing where those patterns show up for you in relationship to sex, how they affect you, and using the steps in your workbook that have to do with belief reprogramming, auto-suggestion. We talk a lot about it in this course, and using those cognitive reframes and supporting piece of evidence. We talk a lot about it in the school, and using those cognitive reframes and supporting pieces of evidence to be able to create transformation at the subconscious level in your stories about yourself and who you are as it relates to sex. So these are some really, really important components. Now, the very last thing that I will highly recommend to do as it relates to this step here is try to just write out 10 or 15 reasons per day that you are worthy of expressing your needs and feelings and desires about sex, that you are good enough to have your own unique feelings and needs about sex, and then try to write out some benefits that come with doing that. Just try to write out what are some benefits if I'm more vocal, if I'm more open, if I'm more honest, if I allow myself to take up space in a sexual interaction, I allow myself to be seen and heard. How does that benefit you and your relationship long term? And utilizing these tools together will make you feel much more empowered in your sexual and intimate interactions. So when it comes to using these exercises as the anxious, preoccupied individual, what I highly recommend doing is taking some time once per week to journal and introspect. This is that step 1, just noticing your own feelings, desires, needs, and then evaluating how much you're actually communicating them. For number 2, when it comes to doing that exposure work and speaking up, try to communicate 1 to 2 times per week. This doesn't have to be like right as you're having sex or right before, right after, or during. All of those things are great, don't get me wrong, but this can even be a conversation you have outside of anything related to sex. This can be a conversation you have over coffee one day. Just normalizing the communication about sex in general. And if you want to try doing something during sex or right before or after sex, that's fantastic as well. Just choose to begin with what feels most comfortable and most easy for you. When it comes to working on limiting beliefs and doing that belief reprogramming work, I highly recommend doing this along with your fears of speaking up and communicating, working on those beliefs and the benefit finding literally once per day until you start to see some transformation in terms of the emotional associations that you're now building up and storing at the subconscious level. The more you see that transformation, the more relief you'll feel and the more comfort and safety and connection you'll feel around communicating your needs in general. And this will actually keep you feeling connected and seen and heard and understood long term and much safer and thriving in your relationship to sex. So, in this next module, we're going to do a deep dive into the dismissive avoidance relationship to sex, some key features, some key patterns to become aware of. So, stay tuned.